once again, Guy Weston. He has been engaged in genealogy research for over 25 years with substantial focus on his maternal ancestors in Timbuctoo, New Jersey, where his fourth great-grandfather bought his family's plot in 1829 for $30. More recently, he has been engaged in various research and public history initiatives to raise the profile of antebellum free African Americans in New Jersey history. And then from 2017 until 2019, he was a visiting scholar at Rutgers University. There he did research that was published in the New Jersey Studies and the Journal of Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, where he also serves as the editorial board. Mr. Weston thinks it's not robbery to share with us all that he has been doing over the past few years. In addition to doing the research, he's taken time to serve as the president of the Timbuctoo Historical Society and is a member of West Hampton Township's Timbuctoo Advisory Committee. He has a master's degree in bicultural studies from LaSalle University, and he maintains a website and curates much of his research in Burlington County's rich history, which can be found at timbuctoonj.com. So after today's presentation, if you're wanting for more, we welcome you to go to that site. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Guy Weston. He will discuss the history of Timbuctoo, what we know and why we know it. Mr. Weston.
Thank you so much, Ms. Williams-Alston, and I thank everyone who took the time to attend this presentation today. I am always looking for excuses to talk about Timbuctoo because I think it's a fascinating topic to talk about. I am pleased that a group such as attorneys would sponsor an event about Timbuctoo because that's just another layer of important outreach, if you will, to let everyone know how important Timbuctoo is. If you go to the next slide, please. So our point of discussion will be what and where is Timbuctoo? I moved to Burlington County in high school and was shocked to learn about Timbuctoo, even though it was in my family. I'm always surprised at how many people who live in places like Tarnsfield or Holly Hills or Irick Woods or Irick Lakes that never heard of Timbuctoo before 10 years ago when we started all of these activities. But you might not immediately think of why it would have legal significance. So we're going to talk about the compelling history and key events of Timbuctoo's development that are found in 19th century legal documents. We're going to talk about the legal challenges faced in preserving African-American historical sites. And we're also going to talk about the aspects of 19th century history that facilitated slavery in some parts of New Jersey and made it more difficult in others. If you move to the next slide. This is the Rancocas Creek that abuts Timbuctoo. I didn't take time to, I believe it would be the left side of this picture that actually abuts to Timbuctoo. What's interesting about this is that the Rancocas Creek leads out to the Delaware River. So this would have been a route of the Underground Railroad that facilitated access to Timbuctoo for people escaping slavery in the South. Next slide. So what is my personal connection to all of this? My fourth great-grandfather purchased a parcel in Timbuctoo on December 15, 1829 for $30. My introduction to genealogy came when my family, my mother and I, inherited the property that my fourth great-grandfather purchased. But we were surprised because when I went to build a house on the property, I went to get title insurance, and the title insurance company said, "You don't own this property." I said, "What do you mean I don't own it? Here's not only a current deed from 1989, here's a deed from 1829, and I can show you how this property passed through different generations of my family." Well, that of course didn't mean anything, and if you are I assume most of this group is attorneys, you understand how heir property gets complicated. So my fourth great grandfather, who bought the property in 1829, died in 1843. His 1842 will divides the premises to his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. When the son-in-law and wife died in 1875 and 1880, they just took that same 1829 deed, because in 1842 there was no transfer of ownership. So in 1842 there needed to be transfer. In 1875, when my third great grandfather died, there should have been another deed. There was none. When he got, when one of his sons lived on the property with his family until around the late 1920s. When he died, he decided he would get a deed. For some reason, he chose a plain warranty deed to transfer ownership to his daughter. And when that daughter died in 1970, her daughter took the 1930 deed and carried it in her pocket and paid the taxes until 1989, when she wanted to give it to me, my mother and me. And that was the deed of record. So we thought we had a significant and robust documentation of chain of titles that would afford us ownership. We didn't understand that in each one of those times when somebody died and passed on the same piece of paper, there were a set of siblings to each of my ancestors that inherited the property. So to make a long story short, the defendants of that quiet title action were the brothers and sisters of my great grandfather, who died in 1938. 5 of those siblings were born before the Civil War. It was an extremely complicated endeavor, so it felt. But the reality is, as you know, serving most of those ancestors was simply an ad in the Bernalillo County Times asking them to speak now or forever hold their peace with regard to any claims on the property. And of course, nobody responded. There were a few younger people, when I say younger, people that were more recent in history, that did have an interest that could respond, but they declined to because it turned out that the property was worth, I think, $20,000 at the time. They were entitled to 10% of it that would have to be divided in 5 ways. So we just had to go through all that process. But the funny thing about it, of course, was that I thought I had something special and I didn't have anything at all. And there are many examples of deeds in Timbuctoo that have similar title problems. There's another one that was lost by the rightful owner in a tax sale in 1998. But the person who bought that tax sale certificate never foreclosed on it. Now the person who lost it, as well as the person who purchased it, are both dead. And the deed is just hanging out there. And it's a small parcel of property, but the challenge becomes responsibility for upkeep and maintenance, and arguments over whether or not the heirs of somebody who own a tax sale certificate that's 20 years old can be required to cut the grass. We think they should, others think they shouldn't. But I'm going to move on to the next slide. These are the people I think about when I think about Timbuctoo, because they're all people that I knew. All but one of these people lived in my lifetime and would tell stories about growing up in Timbuctoo. What I didn't say is that the family moved to Philadelphia around the 1930s. And most of these people, although born in Timbuctoo, I knew them in Philadelphia. They would tell stories about the place where they grew up. I had no idea when we moved to Willingboro in 1973 that we were moving a few miles to the place where they all grew up. But these are the people I always think about when I think about Timbuctoo. Next slide. And so the process of identifying all of the defendants in that quiet title action and the research associated with it was something that I wrote in an essay that appeared in the Journal of the, which was this? This is the Journal of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. And it had a lot of surprising facts. If anyone's interested in it, it's available on the website at the bottom. Next slide. And this, of course, is my mother with our family Bible, which I need to date. But all of those people that were in the picture earlier are recorded in this as they were born. So based on when the records began, I would say it's from about 1885, and it gets passed down through generations of my family. So one thing that people don't realize when we talk about slavery in New Jersey, you can go ahead to the next slide. I'm sorry, that was timely. Essentially, slavery was abolished by gradual manumission in New Jersey. New Jersey was the last state to abolish slavery in 1804. The one before that was New York in 1799. The first one was Pennsylvania in 1780. But most of those were gradual manumission acts that allowed people to become free after a period of apprenticeship with their mother's masters, so that in the case of New Jersey, males born in 1804 would complete their indenture in 1829, and females who had a shorter indenture would complete theirs in 1825. Timbuctoo was founded in 1826. We believe this is one of the sources of people who accumulated resources to buy property in Timbuctoo. Next slide. And I always like to point this out because the dominant narrative about slavery in New Jersey talks about how New Jersey was the last state to ratify the 13th Amendment. New Jersey did not carry Lincoln in the 1860 election, but New Jersey is fickle in ways that are still true today. One of the things I learned in my public health career, you would see a trend like the proportion of HIV cases in the state, or the population in the state, or the any demographic indicator is always worse in the northern part of the state. Why is that? Because the northern part of the state is about 3/4 of the population. So when you hear and that was true in the antebellum period as it's true today. I've looked at each decennial census, and it's always 70-something% of the population in the northern region of the state. So when you take something like slavery and the state's response to slavery, and the fact that the state didn't carry Lincoln in the 1860 election, for example, you're looking largely at the northern counties. It was fascinating for me to learn that as far back as 1790, only 11% of Black people in the southern counties of the state were slaves, while 2/3 were enslaved in the northern counties of the state. And if you follow the trend over time, it wasn't until practically the Civil War when the total population of Blacks in the northern part were free, whereas in the South, by 1820, only 5% of Black people living in the southern counties were enslaved. Go to the next slide, please. And this is just a map that illustrates that. And it's very important in my view, because when we talk about my ancestors and the institutions they founded and the life they lived, they certainly suffered from discrimination and had challenges just surviving. They were able to buy land that we still own. And I'm sure if my ancestors lived in Morris County or Bergen County, that would not be as likely to be the case. And so I always point that out. Go to the next slide, please. What was the difference between the northern counties and the southern counties? There are a couple of different things we can talk about, but most influential in that dynamic was the strong Quaker influence in the southern counties of the state. Philadelphia is, someone referred to the American Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia, which is a Quaker organization that houses other Quaker organizations, as the Quaker Vatican. That's like the hub of Quaker activity in the country. It was then and it is now. So Quakers were so influential to the point of even comprising majority populations in some towns and having strong influence in some places like newspapers. So whereas in the northern part of the state, there was no Quaker influence, or it was very little, and Quakers actually led the push to end slavery. The 1804 Act was a compromise because people thought it wouldn't be fair to the slave owners to lose their slaves instantly. So they did it in this gradual fashion. Next slide. I wanted to point out that all of the northern states had taken action to abolish slavery before New Jersey. All of the northeastern states, the territories in the western part, which had much smaller Black populations, were not nearly as quick. But certainly, if you look, even Vermont was actually first in 1777, but they weren't a state yet. They entered the Union later as a free state. But all of those states freed their slaves long before the southern states, which didn't mostly have freedom for Black people, gradual freedom until 1865. And even then it was difficult. Next slide. And so this is Timbuctoo. This is a sign that this was our first effort, probably around 2006, to remind people that Timbuctoo has historic significance. We actually have a bigger sign. This sign is very small that people wouldn't even see. We now have a sign on the side of the road that's much clearer for people. Next slide. I wanted to point out that Timbuctoo was one of many antebellum settlements, antebellum free Black settlements in southern New Jersey. You'll note that they're mostly all in the southern part of the state. There's one in, I believe that's Essex County, but most of them are in the south. Most of them are located near Quaker strongholds. Timbuctoo is near Mount Holly. Coleman Town was near Mount Holly or Mount Laurel. Lawnside, which was formerly known as Snow Hill or Sadlertown, was near Haddonfield, etc. All of them were close to places where Quakers lived. Next slide. And where Quakers had strong influence. I just wanted to point out, this is where Timbuctoo is located now. You can see Burlington Mount Holly Road going northwest. Below that, you see Wood Lane Road. And thank you with the pointer. So can you point along Rancocas Road? That's right where the Timbuctoo arrow is. That's Rancocas Road. That going back that way is Rancocas, going towards Mount Holly in the opposite direction. I always point out to people, because I'm a geography nerd, that it's only Beverly Rancocas Road between Beverly and Rancocas. That's why it's called Beverly Rancocas Road. After Rancocas, it's no longer Beverly Rancocas Road, it's Rancocas Mount Holly Road, but nobody says that but me. Next slide. But we want to point out that Timbuctoo is still there by virtue of it being on the map. This is an early map of Timbuctoo. You see Route 541 at the top. It says Burlington and Mount Holly Railroad. So Route 541 between Mount Holly and Burlington was actually a railroad in its early years. And then Timbuctoo, you see in the middle. And the angles are funny, so because of the way this map is positioned, but because of how the map is positioned, it looks like Rancocas Road is running southwest. If you go to the bottom of the map that's green, that's Rancocas. And if you go to the top where the dots are, that's Mount Holly. And this was actually called the Turnpike Road between Mount Holly and Rancocas. Next slide. So who were the first inhabitants of Timbuctoo? Legal records, land records in the Burlington County Clerk's Office allow us to know a lot about Timbuctoo that people would not imagine that we can know. We know that David Parker, Ezekiel Parker, Wardell Parker, and Hezekiah Hall, who were all escaped enslaved people from Maryland, purchased lots in 1826 from a Quaker businessman made by the name of William Hilliard. If you're familiar with the Rancocas Nature Center, that was one of the Hilliard homes. I might have been William Hilliard's brother. I don't know if it was him or not, but Hilliards owned that house. The Hilliards also owned a brickyard that's located where Tarnsfield is now. So a lot of these people eventually got jobs working in the brickyards. But the interesting thing here is that each of these four people came with cash in their pockets to buy land in Timbuctoo. The next recorded sale was in 1829, when John Brewer, that's fine, stay there. purchased what is lot 4 on this map. That's good, lot 4. That was the important sale because that was the one that my mother lives on now. So that was like the most important one in my opinion. But the only reason why we're able to know all of these parcels and all of these purchases is because of the records in the county clerk's office, which a lot of people don't even know are there. You see at the very top of that map, it says Holly Turnpike. The whole word would be Mount Holly Turnpike. That is Rancocas Road. Where the north sign is next to lots 10 and 11, that's Church Street in Rancocas in Timbuctoo, I'm sorry. And at the very bottom would be the Rancocas Creek. But these are all of the original or first property owners in Timbuctoo. And a surprising number of these lot boundaries remain today. Next slide.
We're frozen. There we go. Is that the next?
So I said that my mother and I inherited this property. Actually, my mother was the person whose name was on the deed from one of my cousins in that picture. We went to her house one Saturday in the 1980s. And she said, we knew we were going to receive the document for the family property. What we didn't know was that they were largely handwritten documents from the 19th century. So she goes to her bedroom and pulls open a drawer and pulls out an envelope, and out come probably 18 or 20 pages like this, all written by hand. The deed is about 4 pages. The bottom left side is a crude survey. The angle on the right side is Rancocas Road again. And you can see the parcel, the first parcel that my ancestor purchased, and that on the top left is the cover for the deed. This is really all one document folded together. Next slide. So this is why I know it was December 15th, 1829. So what is interesting about the contemporary deed, 2 deeds after this in April 1989, the measurements are in chains and links with reference to 1829 adjacent property owners. It says, you who practice law are familiar with the chain of title that's referenced rather uniquely in New Jersey deeds. All states aren't like this. It says, it normally would say being the same premises that somebody bought 20 years ago. This says, being the same premises which said Samuel Atkinson and his wife, Hannah, by deed bearing a date in 1829, which was December 15th, recorded in the clerk's office, blah, 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 and conveyed and granted to John Brewer in his lifetime in fee. So now, just because I have a deed, this is not a genealogy document. This is the recital in a deed that tells me the name of my 4th great-grandfather. And then it says, and the said John Brewer in his last will and testament bearing a date in 1842, recorded in the surrogate's office, devised said premises to his widow Ann Brewer, and after her death to his daughter Sarah Barnes, who afterward married Lambert Giles and became Sarah Giles. Giles is the name of all those people in that picture. But the thing that excited me about this is that now I know, not from a genealogy document, but from a deed, who was my 4th great-grandfather, what was his name, what was his wife's name, what was his daughter and son-in-law's name. And this became the seed that sort of planted my interest in genealogy and provided me with information to learn much more about my family than most people do. Ann Brewer was born in Philadelphia in 1792, and her family was among the founders of Mother Bethel AME Church, which has tons and tons of African-American history as well. But I only know this from a deed, which is interesting about it. So in addition to the deed, there were several other documents. I only have one example here. In 1842, my 4th great-grandfather, actually his will was 1842. In 1843, he passed away, and 2 years later, his wife, daughter, and son-in-law needed money, so they got a mortgage from William Hilliard for $155. If you're able, can you zoom that as you just did? You don't have to, but what I wanted to be able to point out was the section near the arrow says, received of John Giles, 2,000 bricks at $12 per thousand for the 1875 and 1876 payment on the bond of this mortgage, and it says what the balance is, et cetera. But the point is, he paid the mortgage in 1876 and 1875 with bricks. So I envisioned him driving up to the Hilliard house with a load of bricks, counting off the bricks to pay the mortgage. I said, who would do that? That's silly. Turns out my ancestors worked in Mr. Hilliard's brickyard. And I guess they didn't have money for 1875 and 1876. So my great uncle John Giles and his brother, my great grandfather, and two other brothers had to work in the brickyard to make 2,000 bricks. When 2,000 bricks were made, they didn't collect a salary for that, but that paid the mortgage on the land for those 2 years. We also have, they're not included here, but we have, no, you're fine. We also have his will from those same original documents. From his will, I was able to get the inventory of his estate from the surrogate's office, so I know how many cows, how many pigs, how many tables, everything that he owned, the garments he wore, all because I got this inheritance from my cousin. We now can talk about some other notable events in the development of Timbuctoo and move to the next slide. This is I called it when I did the slide, not sure I should call it this now, but essentially being the trustee in a church was a very serious matter during that period of time. You had to take an oath before a justice of the peace and swear to bear true faith and allegiance to the government of the state, support the Constitution, and faithfully discharge your duties as a trustee to the best of your understanding and ability. After you took that oath, you signed your name, or in this case, names are signed on their behalf on this document, and this document is signed in the county clerk's office. So from this, I know that, go back, please. John Brewer, who was my fourth great grandfather, was a trustee at Mount Moriah AME Church in Mount Holly, which is still there. Major Mitchell was his next door neighbor because we have history with that property as well. And Robert Evans also lived in Timbuctoo, so that we know that this church, which was founded in 1826, before Timbuctoo, was the church that many Timbuctoo residents attended, and my ancestor was a member of the trustee board. And we have that information again from a legal document. Next slide, please. And then we have another one, which was land. We have many of these. These are the most interesting ones. Purchased to establish the African Union School. It said that Peter Quire is the seller, and Edward Giles, Hezekiah Hall, and Major Mitchell are trustees of the deed. Hezekiah Hall was one of those original Timbuctoo settlers that bought half an acre of land for, I think, $7.50. Edward Giles has the same name as my family, so I suspect he's an ancestor. My great uncle, or either my third great grandfather's father. But anyway, it says, interestingly, whereas in the settlement of Timbuctoo, and in the vicinity thereof, there are many people of color, so-called. And I thought this was funny because I literally thought that the term people of color was coined by somebody like Jesse Jackson 20 years ago. I did not know we called ourselves people of color in 1834. But it says these people of color seem to be sensible of the advantages of a suitable school education and are destitute for a house for that purpose. And the said Peter Quire and his wife Maria, in consideration of the premises and the affection they bear for the people of color and the desire they have to promote their true and best interests, are minded to settle, give, grant, and convey said premises to the uses and intents hereinafter pointed out and described. And again, this is a deed. This is not an incorporation document. And then it says that in order to be a trustee, you have to be a person of color that lives within 10 miles of the premises. This document by itself paints a picture of Timbuctoo and a picture of free African-American people in Burlington County that was shocking to me, because you, as a person of color, whether you are someone who escaped slavery in the South or whether you're somebody that was born in New Jersey, in the area, you are able to raise money, work hard to build a school for your community, and you're allowed to say that only people of color can be on the board, and you can file that document with the county clerk, and apparently nobody cares. We have many documents like this. So this is, again, a different picture of Southern New Jersey versus Northern New Jersey. We did this in Burlington County It could have been done in Camden or Salem counties, which were other areas that had a high concentration of Black people. You would not have done this in Middlesex County or Bergen County or the other counties in the north. And it just speaks volumes to me about what life was like for my ancestors. Not that it was peaches and cream, not that they didn't have discrimination, not that they got treated fairly, but the distinction between this community and the communities where my father's people come in South Carolina. You would get lynched for teaching somebody to read. In New Jersey, you could build a school and be exclusive about who's on the board. And it was recognized by the government to the extent that they filed the document in which you made those stipulations. Next slide. And you see at the bottom of all of these, the citations where the deeds are located in the county clerk's office. This is another school that was built 7 years later, right next door. So that first school was right on the corner of Rancocas Road and Church Street. This is the next 2 lots over, which is the lot that my family owns. John Brewer was my 4th great grandfather, and he gave this lot to build a church that also provided education. Next slide. And this is the most important deed for any discussion today, because this is the deed for the cemetery. We say the cemetery is the only above ground remnant of Timbuctoo's history. You ride down Church Street or Blue Jay Hill Road and you see houses, the oldest of which are 60 or 70 years old. Most of them were built in the 1970s or later. And you have no idea that it's a historically significant community. But it says, excuse me, that it identifies the trustees. One of his name is David Parker, and we want to get back to him later. The deed stipulates that the premises are used as a place of religious worship according to the form of government and discipline of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in America, and the place for the burial of the dead of such are in connection with said church or the descendants thereof, and other people that the trustees may decide from time to time. So the denomination is the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, or AME Zion Church, as we know today. The congregation was the Zion Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal African Church of Timbuctoo. But that church, go ahead to the next slide. I'll see if I have support for what I'm about to say in writing. I don't. So we'll stay here for a minute. But the church that founded that cemetery dissolved in 1902. It's now designated as an abandoned cemetery in official records. This geophysical survey, which we have thanks to West Hampton Township for, because it cost about $12,000, is essentially an X-ray of the cemetery property. On your right side, the right side is Church Street. I'm sorry. So north is the top. Oh, can you go back, please? And south is at the bottom. You see a lot of pink little squares. Those are graves. So this is ground penetrating radar that can show you where the graves are. The ones that have black crosses are grave stones. 8 of the 11 marked graves are US colored troops that fought in the Civil War. As a result of the predominance of graves of US colored troops, someone decided they would purchase a nice fancy $1,200 or $1,400 marker and name this the Timbuctoo Civil War Memorial Cemetery. That was a very noble and an act for which we should be thankful. But it actually erases the history of the cemetery because 8 of those stones are soldiers that fought in the Civil War. 3 are members of David Parker's family. David Parker was like the non-elected community leader of Timbuctoo, whose name is on many incorporation certificates and several land transactions. He was like probably the richest guy in town, if you will. And so he could afford to have stone grave markers. U.S. colored troops got stone grave markers because that was a benefit of military service. But most common people had wooden markers that would not survive time. So this is not a cemetery that is predominantly soldiers. It's predominantly people who had wooden markers who belonged to Zion, Wesleyan, Methodist, Episcopal African Church. And so one of our challenges, of course, is to make sure that the history of the church is recognized along with the history of the soldiers. Another thing I want to call to your attention is the blue lines, the sort of an oblong shape of blue lines down the middle of the page. That is a legal boundary of the cemetery. Then you see a jagged pink line that doesn't fit those blue lines. Those are the observed boundaries of the cemetery. So you'll note that on the bottom, between the blue line and the jagged line, I don't know if you could point to that with a pointer or not if you are following my discussion, but the point is that a third of the cemetery is outside of the legal boundaries of the cemetery. Fortunately, the adjacent parcel belongs to West Hampton Township. So I don't know if the mayor is still in the room, but I will announce that our intention is to conduct another ground penetrating radar survey, which is going to cost $9,500. And you'll note that the graves across the bottom red jagged line almost run into, and in some cases, almost overlap on that line. So there's no reason to believe that just because somebody put up a wire fence there in 1980, that that's the real boundary. Certainly there are probably more graves beyond that boundary. So we need to do another survey to find out how far the graves go. And then we're going to take some action and seek to acquire all of the area that has graves and then install a proper fence around it. If you go to the next slide, there's another piece to this puzzle, which I hope is described there. The current legal status of the cemetery. As I said earlier, the church associated with the cemetery dissolved around 1902. The most recent marked grave is dated 1922. It is designated as abandoned in a report from the West Hampton Township clerk to the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs around 2002. And the county clerk's record identified the parcel simply as colored cemetery. So this is a somewhat unique and rather intriguing title condition. We did do a title search last year and determined that there's no activity on the title. Remember I may not have said this. I should have said it here. The deed of record is dated 1854 and it's handwritten. So, and the entity on that deed is the church that dissolved in 1902. So, who owns this parcel? Nobody owns the parcel. That's a problem. Why is that a problem? Because when you apply for grants to improve the cemetery, they want to make sure you have the owner's consent. We don't have an owner. When you go to put up interpretive signs, and I hope we have copies of those later in the presentation, the construction official asked, well, do you have the owner's permission to put those signs up? The cemetery is a pre-existing non-conforming entity in a residential area that only has rules for residential properties. So there are no provisions for signage in residential properties, and West Hampton Township has no zoning for cemeteries, even though I believe there are two other cemeteries besides this one. So the mere act of putting up interpretive signs, which are very attractive signs that tell the history of the community, requires legal hurdles that, I'll say one of the difficult things about talking into a screen in your office at home without being able to see the people in the room is you have no idea how people are reacting to what you're saying. But what I wanted to say, that I wanted to feel people's reactions before I say it, is that there have been many different actions by different well-meaning people regarding the cemetery when it comes to putting up signs, putting up a fence, putting up 2 different signs. And there was never any reaction. People just smiled. We did it the right way and told people what we're doing. And we had to get a permit. We had to get architects' drawings of where the signs would be. We went out one Saturday with a group of volunteers to dig to install the signs. Dig, dig, dig. You run into something hard, which might be a gravestone. You're in a cemetery. You don't want to disturb a body. So we moved over 10 feet and installed the signs in a different place. And people got mad because we didn't follow the proscribed installation locations. And my question, of course, is how often do cemeteries have bureaucratic hurdles like that? How often do cemeteries have to get a utility mark out to put signs in, install signs in a cemetery? So my friend Craig Austin just asked a question, which I'll have to get to after I am finished. I actually can't see the chat. That was the first chat that I saw. Please hold your questions only because I can't see you when you raise your hand. Please hold all the questions in the chat. Please ask them to me when I'm finished, and I'm about to be finished. I think we only have a couple more slides left in my section of this. Next slide. So this is one of those signs. The picture of the signs was early in the presentation. I guess we should have put it later because it's a very nice presentation of the signs and landscaping. But these are, this is the sign that we installed to commemorate the true history of the church, which has the quotation at the top is a quote from the deed, which clearly this is an AME Zion cemetery, not a Civil War cemetery, that belonged to an AME Zion church that quite possibly could have belonged. The successors in title, according to our argument, would be the national denomination. And it goes on to say that the how old when the church was purchased and when the church was established and incorporated, et cetera, in AME Zion history. We even have the names of the trustees. We have the names of the bishop and the presiding elder. The bishop was Christopher Rush. I couldn't believe I got a picture of the real AME Zion bishop from the 1840s online. This sign was purchased by Wesley AME Zion Church of Burlington. Next slide, and we're almost finished. Oh, we aren't almost finished. We have about 5 more slides, and I think I'll see if I can get through them quickly. I forgot about the obituaries. They are from the New Jersey Mirror. So go ahead to the next slide. I'll explain. The New Jersey Mirror was the newspaper of the day, the equivalent of the Burlington County Times, I guess, although it covered more than Burlington County. This is one of 4 obituaries that I found researching family history. This was Hezekiah Hall, who was the husband of my 4th great-grandmother, this was the man she married when my 4th great-grandfather died. It says, in Timbuctoo near Mount Holly on Friday last, February 21st, Hezekiah Hall colored about 60 years. This is basically announcing that he died, announcing that he was a slave, enslaved. I shouldn't say that this is a slave because of the transcript. He belonged to Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Charles Carroll was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Goes on to say that he escaped bondage in 1814, came to our midst in 1824. This is the part I like. He was regarded by everyone as a man of unblemished character, and his truly upright walk and Christian deportment commanded the highest respect. So this is, if you will, the obituary of not a famous Black man, but a common, ordinary laborer, rank and file citizen Black man. And this is his obituary in the local newspaper in 1851, right next to the obituaries of white people. That was how they did things in Quaker-dominated Burlington County. Next slide. This is another picture of the cemetery and the flags that are placed probably by the American Legion or the Boy Scout troop. Next slide. Now, this was the one I liked. Actually, I don't put the label at the top anymore when I do this. I should have erased it here. But I really needed to know when I was doing the research to establish the chain of title, I needed to know what happened to Lambert Giles. I didn't know, maybe they didn't have it at that time, that the New Jersey Mirror is indexed, and I could find this out by putting his name in a database at the Burlington County Library. It said, Lambert Giles, a well-known colored man, long a resident of this vicinity, was found dead by the side of the road from Mount Holly to Rancocas. It says he was walking home from work, that he was an epileptic, probably had a seizure. And at the end it says he was an industrious and worthy man and noted for his courtesy of manner. He was about 6 years old. Next slide. This is Lambert Giles' grave, which is in another cemetery that's adjacent to the Mount Holly bypass. So I had, again, how many people do you know? How many Black people do you know? But people, period, but certainly Black people know where their great-great-great-grandfather's grave is. Mine is at the side of the Mount Holly bypass. And the next week after he died, it said, the Sunday demise of the old colored whitewasher Lambert Giles put a number of housekeepers on the wing to find someone to fill his engagements. It goes on to say that he was good at what he did, blah, 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 and that he'll be more missed than would be more of our many more pretentious citizens. He was often engaged weeks in advance. So I know from this story that he was a laborer that was held in very high esteem. I wonder, since he was a laborer, he owned land, but I wonder why he had a gravestone because so many other people didn't have one. I wonder if the people who liked him bought a gravestone for him, or whether or not the family actually had money to do this, because they didn't have money to do that for many other people. Well, at least we don't have gravestones. I don't know. I shouldn't say that. I don't know why. For example, his wife died 5 years later. She's probably buried right next to him, but there's no stone for her. But next slide. Okay, this is the Battle of Pine Swamp, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think I need to sort of bring this to a close. But this is the story of George Alberti, who was an infamous slave catcher who worked on behalf of Southern slave masters. He lived in Philadelphia, and he would come to catch people and take them back to slavery. He came to catch a guy named Perry Simmons, and he went to a marshal in Morristown to say that Perry Simmons had stolen chickens, so he needed help from the marshal to arrest Perry and take him away. Next slide. The interesting thing about this, which besides the school deed really makes a statement to me about the era or the environment that people lived in. So it was 1,100 words of description of the attempt to capture Perry Simmons. It said things. It called the slave catchers kidnappers and invaders. It's full of humorous anecdotes describing Simmons' response. It said things like, for example, old Alberti at one time started up the stairway, but as he turned round so that the top was visible, he saw the muzzle of Perry's musket was a short distance from his nose. So he came down something quicker than when he went up. And then it says that they concluded that discretion was the better part of valor, and they hastily retreated to their carriages and left the scene of their brilliant achievement. This is Alberti and his crew, as if old Satan was after them. So again, this was the local newspaper, the so-called white local newspaper. This wasn't a Black paper that was invested in particular in helping Black people. It was just it's indicative of the environment. I'm sure that the journalists of the day were maybe more liberal than everybody else, but to find this in 1860 in a newspaper was really fascinating to me. Next slide. We just have, and this really is the end. I'll know my end better next time. Sorry about that. It says the census identified the village of Timbuctoo as a separate entity within West Hampton Township for the first time in 1880, and the numbers of people who live there. Go to the next slide. This is the actual page from the census. This was 1880, this is only one page, obviously. This is not everybody. This was the one time in that period when they actually said Timbuctoo and named everyone under Timbuctoo. But as early as 1830, there were clear details of who lived in Timbuctoo, which challenges a common opinion, which is that Black people can't find themselves in the census before 1870. If we were free people in the North, we were written like everybody else was. Next slide. And so in closing, I point out that free African Americans comprise between 11 and 14% of the population of Black people in every census of 1800. They always existed. If you look at Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, Abyssinian Baptist, which was founded in 1794, Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York City, founded in 1808, Mount Moriah AME Church in Mount Holly in 1826. If there were churches, there might have been enslaved people, but there had to be some nucleus of free Black people. And we know that in each one of these cases, there was a nucleus of free Black people that were doing wonderful things to move their communities forward. And now that we have indexed online databases through sites like Ancestry.com, I'm not the only person who has history like this. So hopefully other people will begin to find their ancestry as well. And I believe the next slide is the final slide of my discussion, which is, and these are rhetorical questions, what kinds of history lessons are contained in the legal documents we discussed? What are some of the legal challenges associated with preserving our history? And how can we use this legal history to enhance teaching of African American history? Going back to the legal challenges, we have clearly the cemetery's deed is the best example, and there are other parcels in the community with title problems similar to that. But it's not just legal problems around titles, it's also if a cemetery is abandoned, whose authority can help the preservation of it. Next slide. And so the last sentence in the last slide was, how can you help? And so there are needs for assistance in quieting titles and identifying documentation related to ownership. And we are actually doing the research to the process for listing properties on the New Jersey and National Registers of Historic Places. It's basically a 65 or 70 page term paper with 20 or 30 pages of tables. That just takes a long time. And we've been working on that for a couple of years. All of us have other jobs, but we hope this year is the year that that task is completed. I will say that the COVID epidemic has caused sequestration and twiddling of thumbs and looking for things to do. And that might be why it gets done this year, because I've been locked up for a whole year. Next slide. So this is my email address and the website after my email address. So if anyone is ever interested in presentations like this, please feel free to give me an email or a call. And I will say that when it comes to, if you're Rutgers University, this costs a lot of money. If you're the local church or the historical society, it doesn't cost a lot of money at all. It probably doesn't cost anything. So don't let cost be a barrier to having education for your groups.